Hello and welcome to the next episode of the ABC Music Talk podcast. This episode forms another part of the basics category that I'm running throughout this podcast series. And in this one, I want to try and cover a phrase that I've heard many times in my career, which is, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I thought it was something we should probably talk about. To me, this is a phrase that, as I say, I've heard throughout my entire career, and therefore I suspect it probably refers to a time before where we are today. So I thought I'd cover this, especially as I'm guessing quite a few of my listeners are people who are new to the music industry, or at least curious about getting into the music industry. And so I have a feeling you'll also come across that phrase many times before, if not already. If you haven't come across it before, perhaps I can just quickly go over what I think it means and what, generally speaking, it's considered to be a reference to, which is somebody's ability to have an impact or progress themselves, or perhaps a project that they're working on, not based on what they know, but more about their network and who they know. It often gets referred to in a sort of a slightly derogatory way of that was easy for them because it's who they know. It's not what they know. That, as in, they're not that good necessarily at what they do, or they're not particularly special, but they know the right people, and therefore they're having the right level of impact. I think that it doesn't necessarily suggest that they're completely clueless, but it does suggest that you can kind of get away with, being not that good at something, because as long as you've got the right network, you can still have an impact. So I thought probably the biggest question that I wanted to try and cover with this was, is that still relevant today? Personally, it's always felt slightly at odds with my own experience coming into the music industry. Despite the fact that these days I'm considered a little bit of a veteran of the business, I was probably one of the first to be formally educated in the music industry. I literally, my degree course was literally something called music industry management, which really was a business course that they'd kind of converted for the music industry. So it did cover things like, we had copyright lawyers come in and talk to us about that and how it relates to licensing practices. A&R people came in and talked to us about that. There was a recording studio, and we learned about some of the basics of recording. We had studio managers come in. We had live promoters, live event managers, and we learned about all sorts of different things to do with kind of every sort of facet of the music industry. It was a pretty decent course by all accounts, and certainly gave me a good grounding in what became my future career, which is of course the point of it. But as I say, I think that from that, and I was like, I think the third year out, to go through this course of, I'm sure at the time in the UK at least, it was the only one of its kind, and so that really does suggest that that was it. That I was the sort of beginning of this new generation of people that were going to be formally educated in the music industry, and I think that that's kind of continued. I think there's been a little bit of a change in attitude towards the sorts of people that should be in the industry, and I say that from a sort of formal education point of view, because I think previously, and I think this is true to a certain degree, a little bit unfair of course to certain people, but typically the industry was full of, previous to me joining it, was really just full of enthusiasts, and I hate to say it, but full of chancers as well. And chancers perhaps a little strong, but the enthusiast bit is definitely true. Of course, it was it had people from other industries that brought in their skill sets around law or finance or business, sales, etc. Logistics for distribution. So yeah, absolutely had professionals within it, of course. Chancers though were that an example would be a manager. Sometimes it was the parent of the artist or the friend of the band, right? And suddenly they were the manager, and it was an official role, and this was an actual job that they were getting paid for, but they didn't have any experience with either being a manager or in the industry. They perhaps hadn't had any marketing experience or distribution experiences, so they were kind of feeling their way through it as much as anyone else. I think another role that was, sort of in this category was, and again, this probably leans slightly more on the enthusiast side of it, but I think has an element of the chancer to it, which is the talent scout. Ultimately, really, you just needed to know about music, and hopefully were quite embedded into culture and community in order to try and extract from it the next big hit, right? That was kind of the point of the talent scout, which obviously often leads to a role in A&R or something like that. And quite frankly, that again is like the dark arts to me. It's a little mysterious, but the people that are good at it are absolutely brilliant at it. And largely, I think it's just they're paying attention to things that seem a little bit trivial to most people, and they turn that into a real art form, and it's honestly truly brilliant. But I guess you can't really be taught that stuff, right? That comes from a pure enthusiast point of view. But yeah, so I think there's been that sort of change that's been going on, and I think it's probably a little bit of a catalyst for this is as technology has really become a huge part of the everyday life in the industry. And certainly the types of roles that I'm seeing advertised are very specialist. And, I'm looking at them thinking, thank God I've got, kind of my own path already carved out, because I don't even know what that job is. That's not something that I would be almost impossible for me to kind of go and learn and be good at it, because I'm too far behind the curve. And that's perhaps coming from, somebody who's just sat and learned about, various bits of marketing and certainly the new tools that are available and all the rest of it, and they're bringing that into the industry. So the what, I've talked a lot about formal education, but of course the what in the phrase is also in reference to experience, right? And that's a large part of the what. Because you're learning on the job a lot of the time. Again, because some of it, because it's art, right? You can't always be taught about that, because art constantly changes and morphs and has influence from everywhere. And so this is where I think this phrase gets a little bit messy, right? Because ultimately, your experience, if you think about that, it really is then a reference point to your own network of the people that you know, and therefore the who aspect to this phrase. Because it almost can't not be, right? And I'm not saying it has to be a very large network, but ultimately your experience is going to be being experienced with being in the industry, and therefore, being around other people. It's just naturally that's how it's going to be. And so that's where I think this phrase gets a little bit kind of messy, or it probably always has been, but in particular, that's how I see it right now. And so therefore the who aspect of this, I think often when people say the phrase, they are making a reference to powerful or influential people. But ultimately, for me, I think it's much more about whether or not somebody's useful or not. Because you can achieve an awful lot if you surround yourself by very useful people. So they don't have to be kind of the CEO of a particular company or a particular celebrity, although often those people are incredibly helpful and therefore useful. But it could just be that it's somebody with a particular skill set that you've added to your team to achieve your goal, and therefore your who aspect, your network, that's nothing to do with what you know. It's about who you know. So I guess what I'm doing at this point is kind of arguing both sides of the coin. I think also on the who side of things, what you figure out later on as you kind of step through this and perhaps have a little bit of budget, normally money's involved, is you can actually hire a lot of the who aspects to connected people, and that can be across many different disciplines, whether that's business development or perhaps a radio plugger or a publicist. Of course, sometimes you can't actually hire those people because they literally won't work with you. It's not because they have a set of principles. I mean, sometimes that's what it is, but often it's they've got a full roster that they just can't take on any more clients, or they don't necessarily like the music or believe in the artist or whatever, right? That there's sort of a different reason to why they won't work with you. But ultimately, once you've made that contact, then they form part of your network, and hopefully if they're good and they've told you, I'm not working with you for that reason, that when they do actually work with you, that they become part of that who part of the concept, which is they helped you get ahead because it's who you got the right plugger or you got the right publicist. So it's as I say, it's quite a funny phrase to me about kind of that. It's if you take it in its very literal sense, it's really kind of not actually always that accurate, but sometimes it is. It absolutely is. Look, I mean, music, it connects people, right? It's about people. So the who aspect, I'm not ever rubbishing it, because I know how important that is. I live and breathe it. My network is kind of everything to me. But so I suppose, sort of in conclusion, and one of the things that I did was I thought, well, rather than just take my opinion for it, I ran a Twitter poll. And what I thought was really fascinating was 80% of the people, because I asked them the question, is it who or what, right? So who or what were two of the options. But then I also gave them a little bit of a kind of get out of jail free card and gave them the both option. And 80% of the people voted for both. But interestingly, 20% voted for the who aspect, which of course is in line with what the phrase represents, which I thought was interesting, but ultimately perhaps not that surprising, given it's such a well-known phrase. One of my friends who's a manager, so in that bracket of chances, he'll hate me for saying that. Fantastic guy, but he said, well, I'd also say that who becomes so because of what you know. So for him, like, he almost kind of flipping the phrase on its head, which I thought was quite an interesting way of looking at it, but ultimately very much in line with some of the things that I've been talking about in this episode. The other thing I thought was something to mention and sort of emphasize was that when we're talking about your kind of your own persona within the industry, your network, you're also part of somebody else's network, and often many other people's network. And so if you think back to what I was saying about how you don't have to be powerful or influential, and it's more about being useful, then you've got to be useful to other people. Otherwise, you're not going to have your own network. And you can only be useful if you actually know something. So that's where the what part of it comes back into it. Otherwise, why would they, keep you in the network or close in the network if you're not very useful to them? And so you've got to be able to know, you've got to know something in order to be useful to them. So I think that was worth kind of pointing out. But regardless, for me, this has always been about both. It's not one or the other, and that's why I think the phrase is a little outdated. And so I wanted to kind of just sort of close on some a little bits of advice. This, I hope, is obvious to most people, but perhaps it's still worth saying. Obviously, get out there and meet people, build that network. That's incredibly important. The other thing is, be nice to people on their way up, because you'll need them as you go down. And I know this personally, and actually I've always taken an attitude towards hiring people, and I've hired a lot of people over the years, either directly for my own companies or for other people's. And I always try and hire people that I genuinely believe I could work for one day. Not at that moment, because they weren't as experienced or as senior, and they don't have that role, but I see that sort of potential in them. And so if I'm hiring people like that, of course I'm going to be nice to them, because that's kind of in the back of my head, right? I'm thinking that could be the boss of the company that, I'm going to work with one day. So, I mean, look, that's a simple do as you would be done by kind of mantra in life. But certainly in the music industry, it's incredibly apparent, because I think a lot of the time, where you've got an industry that often leans heavily on the youth culture, if you look at the kind of demographic breakdown of, say, a Spotify user, so that's, one of the largest ways of making money from recorded music, it's in that sort of 18 to 24-year-old bracket. And so the industry execs that are going to have a lot of impact right now are probably going to be around that age, or certainly closer to it. And so, that's the new people coming up, but eventually they will become, older and wiser and more senior in the industry, but you'll be much, much older by that point. And so you'll be on your way down. And so those young folks that you had in your office during that interview, give them the time of day. If you think that they're off on the way that they're presenting themselves or thinking, then tell them, but do it in a way that's hopefully constructive criticism. Don't be dismissive. Be nice to people. The other thing is, regarding the other side of this phrase, is the what bit, which is you can always learn and master more. And I would say just stay hungry for knowledge. Don't ever get to the point where you think you know everything. I've definitely been guilty of that in the past, and you can often come across as incredibly condescending, and it's not until you kind of sort of get past that little bit of ego that you realize that, damn, I need to really double down and learn, because there's this whole new wave of stuff that's coming through. So stay hungry and learn, and ramp up the what aspect to this as much as your network. So that's all for now. I hope that was interesting. I'd love to hear some comments and feedback, and again, suggestions perhaps, based on this theme for a future episode. I use Twitter. My handle is at Alex Branson. As I've mentioned before in previous episodes, if you put podcast DM, and I will follow you back, and then we can have a direct message conversation, or head to the website www.abcmusic.co. There's a contacts page on there, and you'll find my email address on there, and you can drop me a line there as well. So I hope that was interesting. Thank you for listening.